In the depths of the Cathan interrogation chamber, a heavy, humming energy filled the air, vibrating through the metallic walls like a quiet storm waiting to erupt. Harsh white lights glared down from the ceiling, casting sharp-edged shadows on the cold, alien alloy floor. At the center of the room stood Admiral Vexner, a towering figure draped in ceremonial armor, his iridescent scales catching the sterile glow as he moved with a predator's grace. His presence exuded authority, but there was a tension in his stride, something unusual pulsing beneath his calm. His piercing compound eyes, set deep into a skull that shimmered with blues and greens, locked onto the man chained before him. The prisoner sat upright in his chair, back straight, despite the restraints digging into his wrists and ankles. Silver hair framed a worn yet unyielding face, and eyes like steel stared forward, calm and unwavering. This was no ordinary captive. Thomas Harrington, former general and last appointed commander of Earth's final defense fleet, was not a man easily broken, and that fact alone puzzled the Zarathan High Command. Admiral Vexner began to speak, his voice layered and echoing, both organic and synthesized through his command collar. "Your resistance is illogical," he said, the statement more of an observation than a threat. As he paced, the ambient light flickered across his armored frame. "Your kind has been reduced to a fraction of your former reach. You cling to 3 isolated systems. Your ships are relics. Your colonies are falling like brittle leaves before the storm. Why do you still fight?" Harrington didn't answer. His eyes followed the alien with a quiet intensity, studying him not as an enemy, but as a subject in a test whose results were already known. The silence hung heavy between them until a ghost of a smile flickered across the general's lips. From behind an invisible barrier in the wall, a semicircle of Zarathan officers watched. Their sleek forms shifted restlessly, cloaked in armor that bristled with sensors and weapon interfaces. They were high-ranking strategists, scientists, and commanders, all gathered to witness the interrogation of the human anomaly who had not begged, had not wept, had not even flinched during his capture. Their voices, naturally untranslatable, were rendered into crisp common by the universal translators embedded in their collars. One officer muttered a disdainful comment about the prisoner's primitive biology. Another made notes about the absence of natural defense mechanisms in the human form. No claws, no armored skin, nothing regenerative or particularly threatening. Their fascination was clinical, their remarks sharp and cold. General Harrington remained still. Then, finally, his voice, low, gravelly, yet solid, cut through the air. "Is that what you believe?" Laughter spilled from the observers, sharp and hissing, like metal scraping metal. One particularly bold sub-commander commented on the absurdity of human defiance. "They have lost nearly all their fleet," he hissed. "What are they fighting with now? Courage?" Vexner stopped pacing. He leaned in closer, his tall form looming over Harrington, his breath releasing faint puffs of phosphorescent vapor. "You should not exist," he growled. "Your species was a mistake. You stumbled into faster-than-light travel long before. Your kind was ready. You disrupted the balance of the stars. The galactic hierarchy reviewed your rise and determined, unanimously, that you are not fit for interstellar integration. And still, you resist." The human's eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear but with focus. "You've studied our ships. You've dissected our weapons. You've run simulations on our tactics," Harrington said. "But all of it is meaningless. You never once looked at what truly matters." The Admiral tilted his head slightly, curious but unmoved. "And what would that be?" "Our history." A pause. Then a chittering snarl came from one of the officers. "History is irrelevant. Your entire civilization has existed for the span of a cosmic heartbeat." "In that heartbeat," Harrington said, his tone darkening like gathering storm clouds, We've fought more wars among ourselves than your empire has in its entire existence, not against outsiders, among ourselves, over land, over belief, over nothing. We know war not as a concept, but as a memory etched into our bones. We wrote books about it. We raised monuments. We taught our children what it cost. The tone in the chamber shifted. The laughter had stopped. A subtle stillness spread among the Zarathan spectators. Something in Harrington's voice struck, at the edge of understanding. Vexner straightened, his expression unreadable. You think that makes you strong? I think it makes us ready. The Admiral's claws twitched slightly, the only sign of unease. You cannot win. We've dismantled your defense fleets. What forces remain are fragmented. You are cornered. You attacked our colonies expecting a coordinated military strike, Harrington said. But you didn't get an army. You got people. That's what you're up against. Not Earth's military, humanity. The word hung in the air like a challenge. From the back of the chamber, one of the officers clicked his mandibles. Semantics. There's no difference. There is, said Harrington, voice colder than before. One is a hierarchy. The other is a heartbeat. Vexner took a step back, not in fear, but to reassess. This man, this relic of a species the Empire had already deemed extinct in all but name, was something far more dangerous than a warrior. He was a spark, one that, if left unchecked, could ignite something uncontrollable. And as the quiet settled once more in the heart of that high security chamber aboard a vessel adrift in the cold of space, the alien officers began to sense something they had not accounted for. Something old, buried deep in their adversary's gaze. Not pride, not hatred, but a calm certainty. It wasn't bravado, it was a promise. A stillness lingered in the air after General Harrington's final words, as if the walls of the Zarkathan chamber themselves were absorbing his message, trying to make sense of it. The officers who had once smirked now stood quieter, less sure of their superiority. Their amusement faded into analytical silence. Yet Admiral Vexner remained upright and unmoved, though something subtle shifted behind his eyes, a shadow of doubt creeping into the mind of one who had always relied on logic, on statistics, on the assured supremacy of his empire. The human's defiance had not come from ignorance or desperation. It had come from history. It had come from memory. With mechanical precision, Vexner turned his body away from Harrington, as if distancing himself from the unsettling realization. All things with history fade, he said, claws clicking softly as he walked toward the energy barrier. Flesh rots, empires fall, civilizations pass into memory, forgotten even by their descendants. What remains is strength, not stories. Behind him, Harrington spoke again, not loud, not angry, but with the weight of an entire species carried in his voice. You think stories don't matter? That's where the first mistake was made. One of the watching Zarathan officers tapped something into a wristbound device, but his eyes remained locked on the human. The others watched as well, not with the smug arrogance of earlier, but with a growing need to understand what couldn't be measured. The general leaned forward slightly, his bindings groaning against his movement. There's been a miscalculation, a flaw in the analysis. All your scans, all your algorithms, they show your fleets surrounding ours, your victories stacking one by one. But none of it accounts for what's happening back home. Vexner's brow furrowed slightly, barely perceptible beneath the thick armor plating of his skull. What are you implying? The fleets that were destroyed, Harrington said, meant something once. But they are relics of an era that ended long before this war began. Those ships, those formations, those were never the core of our power. You captured a shadow. A murmur passed through the group of officers, their posture subtly shifting, their antennae twitching in reaction. The general's voice hardened. Our warships haven't been mass-produced in decades. not because the need wasn't there, but because the desire for peace was stronger. We dismantled armies willingly, diverted resources toward building homes, not fortresses. That wasn't weakness. That was a decision, one that can be unmade. The tension in the chamber deepened. A strange hum seemed to pulse from the walls themselves, as if the ship's systems could feel the shift in atmosphere. Every orbital ring, every lunar station, every industrial colony stretching from Mercury to the Kuiper Belt, Harrington continued, has turned. Not in defense, but in purpose. Machines once designed for exploration now forge armor plating. Fabricators once tasked with building homes now construct targeting arrays. Children who played with toy rockets last week are helping their parents code guidance systems. One of the junior officers inhaled sharply, his claws twitching around, the edge of his datapad. This is a bluff. But another officer, older and more experienced, stayed quiet. He knew the look in Harrington's eyes. That wasn't the expression of a cornered man bluffing to stall. That was the gaze of someone who had already lit the fire and was now merely watching to see when it would reach the enemy's feet. The admiral remained still, but his posture had stiffened. The confident composure of a few moments ago now stood, on the edge of unease. "Your infrastructure has never focused on war," he said with firm precision. "Your economic output has always leaned toward civil progress, not military escalation." "It did," Harrington replied, "until yesterday." Those words hit like a seismic tremor. No alarms sounded, no explosions rocked the hull, yet every alien in that room suddenly felt as though something vast and uncontrollable had been set in motion just outside their view. The general's eyes, sharp as ever, bored into Vexner's soul. "It wasn't your victories that triggered this. It was your mistake. You didn't break our armies. You invaded our homes. You didn't face soldiers. You threatened families. And in doing so, you unified people who never needed a banner." Another pause followed, heavier than before, filled with the weight of unspoken reckoning. "Your empire underestimated the human condition," Harrington said. "Always so quick to dissect the surface, our biology, our tools, our ships. But the spirit, the instinct, that part never made it into your reports." Vexner turned slightly, speaking more to his own commanders than to the prisoner. "How many of their industrial centers are operational?" A nervous glance passed among the officers. One of them responded, voice low and uncertain. "Based on last intercepted transmissions, planetary networks have entered emergency manufacturing protocols. But the numbers, the scale, they're reawakening," another said, almost in a whisper. Harrington nodded slowly. "And this time, the blueprints aren't coming from war rooms. They're coming from living rooms, backyard, garages, university labs, from places you thought irrelevant. That's how it always begins." The admiral didn't respond. "By the time you realize what's happening," Harrington said, voice quieter now, almost mournful, "it will be too late to stop it." A long silence followed. For the first time since his arrival aboard the Zarathan vessel, the human was no longer merely a prisoner. He was a symbol, not of resistance, but of resurgence. And those who had come to mock him now studied him as one would study the first tremor of a coming storm. Not with curiosity, but with dread. Outside the chamber, beyond the starboard viewing, panels, 1,000 stars burned in cold silence. But somewhere among them, the tide had already turned. The machines had awakened. The minds had aligned. The quiet heart of a once peaceful civilization had begun to beat faster, louder, stronger, and the galaxy, so long used to humanity's silence, was about to hear it roar. A low thrum echoed through the walls of the interrogation chamber, not from machinery or movement, but from the weight of realization settling into the minds of the Zarathan elite. Gone were the casual smirks and academic detachment of those who had come to observe the human prisoner like a curious specimen. In their place stood silent figures, still armored and armed, yet strangely fragile beneath the burden of what they had just heard. General Harrington sat in the same chair, bound at wrist and ankle, yet the very room seemed to tilt in his favor, as though the gravitational pull of truth had shifted toward him. His words lingered in the stale air like smoke, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore. He had exposed a fracture in the foundation of Zarathon's superiority, not through violence, but through conviction. Their empire had not simply misjudged a military force, it had misread an entire species. A younger officer, one who had mocked. The general earlier now stared at his datapad with wide eyes, uncertain whether to speak. The numbers scrolling across his display betrayed something no one had expected: rapid increases in electromagnetic output from Earth's industrial zones, unusual energy patterns on colonies once thought neutral, fleet movement simulations being overwritten by non-linear patterns, chaotic, unpredictable. The Empire's algorithms were failing, and the failure whispered of something ancient and primal awakening beneath humanity's peaceful exterior. One officer broke the silence, voice tight and unsteady. This cannot be. Their infrastructure was not built for war. Harrington didn't even look in his direction. It wasn't, he said plainly. But it was built by hands that remember it. Another murmured in disbelief, trying to justify the data. They lacked coordination, no formal structure, no unified doctrine. They don't need one, Harrington replied. That's your second mistake. You assumed command lies in rank. In our world, it lies in purpose. Vexner's compound eyes narrowed. The cracks in his authority were subtle but visible. His claws curled slightly as he addressed the prisoner again, a shade more careful now. What exactly has been set in motion? The general's eyes gleamed, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. Every human with a memory of silence now holds the hammer of retaliation. The engineers who designed peaceful propulsion, systems have rewritten their blueprints. The teachers who once lectured about unity now speak of sacrifice. The farmers who nurtured crops in red soil are now calculating nutrient routes for combat logistics. Every system is repurposing. Every hand is working. Not because they were ordered to, but because something deeper than command has taken hold. A chill seemed to pass through the chamber despite the artificial climate. One of the senior strategists tapped into the central network, attempting to locate any pattern in the chaos of human activity. But the nodes lit up not in lines or chains, but in bursts, erratic, decentralized, yet all moving in one direction. It was not a military strategy. It was a cultural eruption. Another officer, older and more weathered than the others, turned, slowly toward Vexner. His voice carried the tremor of someone who had seen too much to dismiss what he did not understand. It's not command they're following. It's a memory, a collective instinct. The admiral remained silent, though his breathing had grown shallower. Behind him, the others exchanged uneasy glances. These were beings who had once mocked the fragility of the human form, who had laughed at their lack of carapace or regeneration. And yet here they stood, alien warriors shielded by armor grown from 1,000 years of conquest, shaken by the calm words of a bound man with silver hair. Harrington spoke again, his voice softer now, almost reverent. This isn't the first time the stars have seen human war. Long before contact, before diplomacy, before space itself became reachable, the ground ran red with what we did to one another. We remember what it cost. Entire generations lost. Cities burned, oceans poisoned. And when the smoke cleared, we made a vow. Never again. That vow wasn't forgotten. It became part of us. He paused, letting the silence wrap around, the room like a closing door. But that vow was never meant to bind us forever. It was a choice, and choices can be remade. One of the younger officers turned sharply, frustration spilling into fear. You expect us to believe this shift happened overnight? No. Harrington answered. "It began the moment your ships darkened our skies." Vexner took a step forward, compelled by something he couldn't explain. "What is it then? What gives them this unity?" The general's eyes locked onto his. "Loss, pain, and memory. You invaded a species that sings about its sorrows, paints its tragedies, and teaches its children the weight of every life taken. You brought death to people who have always feared what war could become. But now that fear has turned, not into terror, into resolve." A faint sound crackled through the chamber's comm panel, an encrypted message intercepted from an outer listening post. One of the officers replayed it through the chamber's speakers. No images, only the sound of machinery. Heavy, synchronized, relentless. The rhythm of factories not built for war, but now hammering toward it with purpose. Vexner's voice grew, quiet. "Then it has already begun." Harrington nodded, the barest motion of his head. "Not with an order, not with a fleet, with a decision. A collective breath drawn by millions. And when it is released, you will feel it in every system you thought was yours." The chamber dimmed slightly as the ambient systems rerouted power to the upper decks. Somewhere in the vast distance of space, where coordinates had once marked peaceful colonies, a fire had been lit. Not of fuel or ordnance, but of memory and determination. Vexner said nothing. For the first time in his career, he could not calculate the outcome. The human before him had not threatened, had not pleaded. He had only spoken. And through those words, an empire that had once considered itself invincible began to tremble. Not from fear of what humans possessed, but from what they had become. In that moment, the war shifted. Not with explosions or casualties, but with understanding. The Empire had studied ships. It had studied weapons. It had studied strategy. But it had never studied the soul. A deep rumble passed through the structure of the Zarathan flagship, distant yet unmistakable, as though the void itself had begun to stir in protest. Within the chamber, tension crystallized into silence so dense it clung to every armored frame and flickering console. The lights flickered once. No malfunction, simply a system reaction, a tremor in a ship built to conquer, not to feel. General Harrington rose slowly from his chair, the locks on his restraints snapping open with mechanical precision, not from any action taken by those within the room, but from a signal delivered remotely. A command that bypassed every level of security the Zarathan engineers had so arrogantly deemed unbreakable. Alarms followed, wailing through the ship's corridors with a shrill urgency that tore away the last remains of confidence from the watching officers. The human stood tall, no longer a prisoner, no longer bound by steel or assumption. His expression remained steady, eyes sharp with the calm of someone whose warning had come to pass. Vexner stepped back involuntarily, caught between instinct and disbelief. Before any command could leave his lips, Harrington spoke, voice unwavering, quiet and final. That would be the first wave. The chamber lights dimmed again, not in defeat, but in recognition, acknowledging something ancient that had reawakened, something no star chart could predict, no algorithm could contain. Behind the transparent viewport spanning the chamber wall, the cosmos unveiled a scene that none aboard the vessel had expected. Thousands upon thousands of small, swift vessels emerged from the darkness, their designs unfamiliar, their movements too fluid, too unorthodox for standard formation analysis. These were not remnants of a broken fleet. They were something new, something born not of war factories, but of desperation, unity, and ingenuity. The ships did not adhere to any known protocol. They twisted through space in seemingly chaotic patterns, yet moved with a precision that defied expectation. Each motion was part of a larger purpose, a silent language only humans seemed to understand. The Zarathan officers stood frozen, their gaze locked on the unfolding armada. These ships had never appeared in simulations. No intelligence reports had described them. They existed beyond the expectations of the Empire's most sophisticated predictions. And now, they approached with a momentum that spoke of vengeance, tempered by patience. Harrington stepped forward, the alarms crying out around him like distant battle drums. "You wanted war," he said, his voice reaching every corner of the chamber. "We will give you war." As the first wave of human vessels streaked across the stars, glowing trails igniting the darkness like firebrands, the flagship shuddered. Explosions rang out, not on the hull, but within the command feeds, the external sensors, the systems designed to observe and outthink. Human technology, once dismissed as outdated, had adapted in ways the Empire had not anticipated. Not refined. Not replicated. Evolved. Vexner's claws clenched. All his simulations, all his strategic projections, were dissolving into static. Every offensive advantage, every calculation of overwhelming force was now meaningless. His empire had studied Earth's weapons, dissected its machines, learned its tactics. But the truth stood before him, calm and immovable. What had never been studied, what had always been overlooked, was now their undoing. Tenacity, memory, imagination. The refusal to yield when reason declared surrender. That was what had risen from the ashes of fractured colonies and shattered peace. Behind, the admiral, the officers began speaking in rapid bursts, their translators struggling to keep up. Orders were issued, fleet commands were transmitted, defense protocols surged online, but none of it felt decisive. It all felt late. The war had not started when the first shot was fired. It had begun in the moment the first human child watched a village burn. In the moment, a peaceful scientist received news of a fallen cousin. In the moment, silence turned to action. The impact of the assault could not be measured in firepower alone. Human ships attacked from directions no predictive system could track, exploiting weaknesses no Zarathan engineer believed possible. The assault was more than military. It was conceptual. An entire empire was now being forced to confront a truth it had long denied. Humanity was not just fighting for survival. It was fighting with purpose. And it was fighting with the clarity of rage awakened too late to prevent, but early enough to avenge. Vexner turned to face Harrington fully. For the first time in his long command, the admiral's expression was not one of domination. It was recognition. Not of power, but of consequence. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "We underestimated you." Harrington's gaze remained locked on the chaos unfolding outside. "No," he replied. "You underestimated what happens when you give pain to people who carry history in their bones." Outside, the flagship's outer defenses activated, but the damage had already begun. Docking bays erupted in flame. Communications blacked out in bursts. Drone interceptors failed to track the smaller vessels darting like fireflies through shadow. The Empire's greatest war machine, once the hammer of conquest, now reeled beneath an assault designed not to impress, but to dismantle. Even as explosions rippled across the outer hull, Harrington remained unmoved. His eyes reflected the glow of his people's retaliation, not with joy, but with inevitability. This had never been about glory. This was about survival, about memory, about standing not for what had been lost, but for what remained. The lesson burned brightly now in the heart of the Empire. Humanity was not a species of conquest, but a force of reckoning. Vexner looked once more through the viewport, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of what was coming. The stars no longer looked peaceful. They pulsed with fury. In the end, no strategy mattered. No superiority endured. The Zarathan Empire had not declared war on humans. It had awakened them,